A sudden shift in operational reports hinted at movements that were not meant to be seen. By midday, military observers noted unusual troop concentrations along the northern sectors of the border, concentrations that official statements described as routine rotations. However, in expert circles, questions were already emerging about the timing and scale of these deployments. Throughout the morning, satellite imagery and intercepted communications suggested a coordinated advance of multiple mechanized units, yet no official confirmation followed. Analysts monitoring the region noted discrepancies between public statements and on-the-ground signals. Lines of logistics vehicles appeared in areas previously marked as inactive, and the pace of reconnaissance flights increased. But further developments revealed that the situation was more complex than surface indications suggested. At this hour, reports indicated that air surveillance detected movements deep within contested zones, movements that were not aligned with known defensive protocols. According to sources familiar with planning sessions, high-level discussions were underway to adjust strategic postures in response to these maneuvers. The information emerging was selective, fragmented, and sometimes contradictory, creating an atmosphere of quiet urgency. Yet, official communications remained composed, emphasizing stability and control. Meanwhile, intelligence channels noted that additional artillery units had been redeployed near the border. Officially, these redeployments were attributed to training exercises. Unofficially, insiders suggested that the positioning reflected a broader operational objective, one that had been developing for weeks, largely hidden from public attention. The contrast between the measured tone of public announcements and the subtle signals observed on the ground generated a sense that the day's unfolding events were only partially visible to external observers. In parallel, diplomatic correspondences circulated through quiet channels, hinting at attempts to gauge international reactions without attracting public scrutiny. Analysts interpreted these actions as precautionary measures, signaling awareness of the broader geopolitical sensitivity surrounding border operations. At the same time, local monitoring networks reported increased electronic activity consistent with the initiation of operational command protocols, further suggesting a deliberate, pre-planned sequence of actions rather than sporadic adjustments. On the surface, the narrative conveyed by official spokespeople was of routine border security management. In reality, multiple indicators pointed to a coordinated offensive strategy that was quietly entering execution phases. Observers in military and policy think tanks noted that the patterns of movement, logistics, and surveillance implied a larger design, one whose full scope remained concealed from the wider public. The juxtaposition of calm official messaging and anomalous field activity created a palpable tension across analytical networks. By midday, fragmented reports suggested that units were positioning along axes historically used for rapid deployment but were now seeing intensified logistical support. This observation contradicted routine rotation patterns, hinting at the preparatory stages of a larger operational plan. Sources inside regional command structures cautiously acknowledged the existence of contingency measures that could escalate quickly, yet official channels maintained a narrative of controlled and measured activity. However, deeper scrutiny revealed that the underlying structure of these movements was not consistent with defensive postures alone. Supply lines, reconnaissance sweeps, and tactical communications suggested coordinated offensive planning, indicative of a significant operational shift. Experts debated whether the timing was opportunistic or part of a sustained strategic design, noting that the orchestration implied a level of planning that surpassed conventional border adjustments. Despite the prevailing official calm, patterns detected in these hours hinted at a subtle but deliberate recalibration of military posture. Analysts emphasized that what appeared minor or routine might in fact signal the initiation of a significant phase of operations. The signals were clear to those tracking developments closely, yet hidden beneath layers of official narrative and procedural normalcy. It is increasingly evident that the events of this day represent more than standard maneuvers. The full implications remain uncertain, but the indicators, movements, redeployments, and communications suggest that observers should remain alert. Possibly, the broader significance of today's developments will only emerge as operations progress, revealing the depth of the planning already underway. But further developments suggest that this is only the first layer of a more complex and carefully orchestrated strategy. Perhaps it is worth following what unfolds next, as the day continues to reveal intentions that have long been concealed. In the hours that followed the initial signs of movement, the picture began to clarify, though still in fragments. Observations from regional monitoring posts indicated that mechanized columns were being supported by expanded logistical networks, including fuel convoys and mobile maintenance units. Official reports maintained that these were standard rotations, yet the patterns did not correspond with previously documented schedules. Analysts in expert circles began mapping these anomalies, noting a convergence of activity along corridors historically associated with rapid offensive thrusts. Between the lines of official statements, more subtle indicators emerged. Communication traffic observed through open-source channels suggested the activation of reserve brigades, while satellite imagery confirmed the presence of temporary field fortifications and newly established observation posts. Experts pointed out that these measures, while publicly framed as precautionary, implied preparation for sustained operations rather than mere border security adjustments. At the same time, reports from civilian sources near border regions mentioned heightened vehicle activity and unusual aerial reconnaissance flights, corroborating the signals detected by military analysts. In these hours, intelligence assessments focused on interpreting the operational tempo. Multiple units were seen maneuvering into positions that optimized coverage of transit points and supply lines. Official statements described these as routine strategic alignments, but internal sources suggested that the deployment reflected broader tactical intentions. Analysts noted that the coordination between armored units, artillery placements, and logistical support implied an integrated operational plan, one that could rapidly escalate if executed as indicated by current patterns. At the same time, diplomatic channels quietly relayed assessments regarding regional stability. Messages circulated among Allied monitoring teams suggested concern over the timing of movements, particularly in relation to neighboring territories. Experts in these networks interpreted the data as an implicit signal. The operational framework being implemented could shift the balance of influence along the border without triggering immediate overt confrontation. However, the full scale of the intentions remained opaque, leaving analysts to extrapolate from partial evidence and subtle operational markers. Technical assessments of supply line efficiency indicated that resupply routes had been reinforced beyond routine capacity. Analysts noted that the distribution of equipment and munitions was concentrated in areas aligned with potential offensive axes. Official briefings did not comment on these logistical enhancements, emphasizing stability and routine management. Yet the coordination of movement, timing, and distribution patterns suggested that these measures were designed to sustain a high-tempo operation if required. The contrast between public reassurance and observed preparation created a dissonance that heightened scrutiny within expert circles. In parallel, intelligence sources reported increased coordination among command elements. Data from communications nodes implied that decision-making processes were being centralized, possibly to streamline operational responses. Analysts considered this a preparatory step for rapid maneuvering, noting that centralized coordination is typically characteristic of offensive readiness rather than defensive posture. Observers began to assemble maps of likely operational vectors, cross-referencing troop concentrations with terrain advantages and historical movement corridors. Meanwhile, reconnaissance indicated that electronic and signal surveillance had been expanded, with a focus on monitoring potential interference along the anticipated axes of movement. Experts highlighted that such efforts are indicative of a dual-purpose strategy, securing operational freedom while denying adversaries real-time awareness. These findings, while technical, reinforced the perception that the unfolding activity was deliberate, structured, and pre-planned. By midday, analysts began consolidating the disparate indicators into a preliminary operational assessment. Patterns suggested the deployment of multiple brigades along synchronized axes, supported by artillery and rapid response units positioned to exploit any breach. Official channels refrained from acknowledging the scope of these movements, maintaining a narrative of controlled routine exercises. The contrast between observed activity and public explanation underscored a deliberate opacity, ensuring that external audiences would interpret movements as standard, while internal forces executed a more ambitious plan. It became increasingly clear that the observable actions were only the visible portion of a broader operational architecture. Analysts emphasized that the alignment of units, logistical reinforcements, and reconnaissance coverage were consistent with preparations for a concentrated operational initiative. The day's developments, while superficially appearing as procedural adjustments, were in fact shaping a complex network of potential maneuvers with multiple contingencies. The situation retained an air of uncertainty. While official channels projected composure, the accumulation of indirect evidence suggested a calculated escalation. Observers in strategic monitoring groups began recommending heightened attention to incoming signals, anticipating that subsequent movements would provide clearer confirmation of intentions. The first layer of analysis had revealed significant anomalies, yet the deeper operational rationale was only beginning to emerge. For now, the day's activity remained in a tension-filled equilibrium, measured outwardly, increasingly assertive inwardly, and quietly unfolding a sequence whose implications extended far beyond routine rotations. In the coming hours, the coherence of these movements was expected to clarify, but even now, the patterns were telling a story that official accounts had not yet acknowledged. The unfolding operational landscape demanded vigilance, as every signal, every maneuver, and every adjustment contributed to a larger narrative that was only partially visible. In expert circles, the consensus formed that today marked a critical phase of recalibration. While public messaging emphasized stability, the internal logic of operations suggested coordinated preparation. Possibly, what appeared as incremental movements would soon reveal a decisive sequence, and observers were advised to maintain close scrutiny. However, as the pieces fell into place, it became apparent that even this careful analytical picture captured only part of the truth. Beneath the routine explanations, a deeper structure was quietly emerging, one that would shape the day's unfolding events in ways that were only beginning to be understood. The operational picture began to shift in unexpected ways. Signals intercepted in these hours indicated that movements previously thought to be routine rotations were in fact part of a carefully sequenced strategy. Analysts noted that units were not simply moving along predictable paths, they were positioning to maximize flexibility, creating a network of options that could rapidly pivot depending on emerging conditions. Official statements maintained that these deployments were precautionary, yet sources inside the command structure quietly confirmed that the scale and precision of coordination exceeded standard planning parameters. In these moments, the distinction between routine activity and active preparation became increasingly pronounced. Reconnaissance detected temporary staging areas, reinforced supply depots, and forward command elements integrated into zones previously considered non-essential. Experts observing these developments emphasized that the simultaneous activation of multiple operational layers suggested a high level of strategic intent. Official spokespeople remained measured in their messaging, highlighting readiness and security, but internally, the mechanisms for rapid escalation had already been set in motion. At the same time, electronic monitoring revealed heightened communications traffic among units in the northern sectors. Analysts interpreted this as an indication of real-time coordination, likely designed to synchronize movements across dispersed formations. The implications were clear: the day's developments were not isolated maneuvers but the opening acts of a more complex operational sequence. Observers tracking these signals noted that the apparent calm projected publicly masked a dynamic system, carefully calibrating its advance while controlling external perception. Meanwhile, diplomatic networks began quietly adjusting assessments. By midday, messages circulated suggesting concern over potential escalatory effects. Analysts in these channels noted that the orchestration of forces was precise, yet subtle enough to avoid immediate detection in public reporting. The coordination of mechanized brigades, artillery positioning, and electronic surveillance implied not only tactical intent but strategic forethought. Official communications did not acknowledge these elements, emphasizing routine security management, but the alignment of activity clearly contradicted such narratives. Local monitoring teams reported that supply convoys were maintaining unusually rapid tempos, moving along routes previously identified as secondary. Experts concluded that these adjustments were consistent with operational redundancy, ensuring resilience in case of disruptions. The pattern suggested preparation for a multi-directional initiative, one capable of exploiting gaps in adversary coverage. Despite official reassurances, analysts highlighted that the subtle intensification of activity was indicative of an underlying operational rhythm, carefully designed to establish dominance while minimizing exposure. Further analysis revealed that the day's movements were synchronized with both top-level strategic directives and field-level operational discretion. Units were positioning along axes that allowed rapid concentration or dispersal, signaling a capability for both offensive and defensive adaptation. Intelligence sources emphasized that such coordination was unusual outside full-scale planning exercises, reinforcing the notion that today's operations represented an orchestrated strategic initiative rather than routine procedures. The juxtaposition of outward calm and intricate internal coordination created a sense of controlled tension, underscoring the calculated nature of the unfolding events. In parallel, experts examining electronic signatures noted the activation of contingency protocols, likely intended to preserve operational momentum even under changing conditions. The presence of these systems suggested that decision-makers anticipated a fluid environment and were prepared to adapt rapidly. Observers remarked that the complexity of these layers, combined with the selective opacity of official communications, conveyed a dual message: preparedness to act decisively, yet commitment to controlling perception externally. By midday, the emerging assessment among analysts was that the initial interpretations of movements had underestimated the scale and intent of the operation. What appeared as incremental deployments were, in fact, part of a deliberate strategy to secure tactical advantages across multiple sectors. Sources within strategic monitoring networks emphasized that the integration of mobility, logistics, and electronic oversight created a dynamic operational matrix capable of rapid escalation if necessary. Official statements continued to highlight stability, yet the day's pattern of activity increasingly suggested the presence of coordinated offensive intent. Observers in specialized circles noted that the day's unfolding actions were not merely a reaction to local conditions but reflected a broader operational calculus. Units were systematically placed to exploit both terrain and timing advantages, while simultaneously maintaining plausible deniability in public reporting. Analysts highlighted that the orchestration required precise synchronization of logistics, command, and reconnaissance elements that collectively indicated premeditated design rather than opportunistic adjustment. In these hours, the contrast between external messaging and internal signals became striking. Analysts monitoring the flow of information concluded that the day's operations were entering a critical phase. A hidden sequence was unfolding, one designed to establish both tactical and strategic leverage. The public narrative remained one of stability, but the internal reality was far more dynamic, controlled, and deliberate. Possibly, it is worth continuing to follow developments closely, as the underlying intentions may soon reveal themselves with greater clarity. What appeared to be measured movements may in fact be the opening stages of a decisive operational shift, an orchestration that is only partially visible to external observers. However, even as analysts pieced together this emerging framework, the full complexity of the operation remained obscured. Beneath the surface, multiple contingencies were being evaluated and synchronized, suggesting that today's events were merely the first public layer of a far-reaching plan. Observers who maintain vigilance may gain insights before official channels acknowledge the scale of what is occurring. By midday, the operational tempo had visibly intensified, though official communications continued to emphasize stability and routine oversight. Analysts monitoring the region noted that previously quiet sectors now exhibited pronounced logistical movement, including the mobilization of additional artillery units, support vehicles, and forward supply bases. Observers emphasized that these adjustments were not isolated. Rather, they formed a coordinated network intended to enhance operational reach and resilience across multiple axes. The contrast between outward calm and underlying activity grew increasingly stark. Signals from intelligence sources indicated that command structures were actively refining tactical objectives in real time. Units positioned along the northern corridor appeared to be synchronized with neighboring brigades in a manner that suggested a multi-layered plan. Analysts in strategic monitoring groups noted that such coordination required both precision and foresight, implying that today's operations were the product of extensive pre-planning, rather than reactive measures. In parallel, communications networks showed intensified encryption activity, consistent with efforts to preserve operational secrecy while transmitting high-volume data between command nodes. Reconnaissance confirmed that multiple staging areas were prepared for rapid deployment. Armored units were seen maneuvering to secure approach routes, while mobile artillery platforms positioned themselves along secondary corridors previously considered peripheral. Experts highlighted that these movements indicated a deliberate effort to consolidate operational flexibility, allowing for both rapid concentration of force and dispersal if required. Official channels refrained from acknowledging these patterns, describing the deployments as routine alignment exercises. Yet the analytical community recognized a clear escalation of capability and intent. At the same time, supply chains were observed operating at accelerated capacity. Logistics units maintained unusually high throughput, distributing munitions, fuel, and provisions across dispersed units. Analysts noted that this level of operational support exceeded standard rotation requirements, suggesting that today's deployments were not intended to remain static but rather positioned for sustained action. The synchronization of logistics, reconnaissance, and command indicated a deliberate orchestration designed to enable decisive maneuvering while maintaining plausible deniability in public reports. Simultaneously, electronic and signal monitoring detected expanded surveillance across key sectors. Analysts interpreted this as preparation to secure real-time intelligence and maintain situational awareness during potential engagements. The deployment patterns, timing, and observed redundancies pointed to a comprehensive operational framework, one that could respond dynamically to evolving circumstances. The day's movements, superficially appearing measured, were in fact part of a deliberate escalation designed to establish operational superiority while minimizing visible exposure. Analytical teams began mapping potential vectors of advance, correlating terrain features, unit positions, and logistical support lines. The emerging picture suggested that forces were not merely repositioning defensively but were being arranged to exploit strategic opportunities along multiple axes. While public messaging emphasized routine border management, the underlying reality reflected a nuanced escalation capable of rapid execution. Observers in strategic circles began interpreting these signals as indicative of a deliberate, high-stakes initiative with regional implications beyond immediate tactical considerations. In parallel, intelligence from diplomatic channels hinted at the broader geopolitical sensitivity of the day's operations. Analysts noted that movements were likely calibrated to test both adversary responsiveness and international reaction. The orchestration implied a layered approach, securing tactical advantage while assessing the threshold of external engagement. Official statements continued to highlight calm, but the alignment of forces and precision of deployment revealed a deeper operational intent. By midday, it became evident that today's activities were more than standard maneuvers. The simultaneous adjustment of command structures, enhanced surveillance, and logistical throughput indicated that a comprehensive operational escalation was underway. Analysts emphasized that such synchronization was typically associated with deliberate offensive readiness rather than routine defensive preparation. The contrast between the measured public narrative and observable operational dynamics created a palpable tension within expert networks. Observations suggested that contingencies had been established for multiple scenarios. Units were positioned to allow rapid concentration of firepower, while electronic monitoring maintained a robust defensive and reconnaissance grid. Analysts highlighted that these preparations reflected a balance between offensive potential and operational security, a duality that allowed for escalation while minimizing public exposure. The precision and scope of today's developments underscored the careful orchestration of a wider plan whose full contours remained partially concealed. As the day unfolded, additional signs of escalation became apparent. Supply lines, previously routine, now supported multiple parallel deployments. Forward elements prepared to advance along axes that were historically high risk, yet the coordination of resources, command, and intelligence suggested a calculated approach to minimize exposure while maintaining operational momentum. The contrast between external assurances and internal activity grew increasingly pronounced, signaling that the day's events were entering a decisive stage. In expert circles, discussions turned to the implications of these movements. Analysts noted that while public messaging emphasized controlled rotations, the operational reality pointed to an integrated escalation capable of rapid execution across multiple sectors. Each adjustment, each logistical enhancement, and each maneuver reinforced the impression of a methodical, pre-planned initiative. The day's developments were no longer simply preparatory, they constituted an active, unfolding operational escalation with strategic intent. However, even as these patterns became clearer, the full scale of the underlying plan remained obscured. Observers recognized that the day's activities were only one visible layer of a broader operational design. The orchestration of units, logistics, and intelligence suggested a high degree of foresight, implying that subsequent phases could significantly alter the operational landscape. Analysts advised close monitoring, understanding that today's apparent stability concealed a far-reaching and carefully calibrated escalation. Yet behind the composed official narrative, the movements continued to reveal the depth of the strategy. Each signal, each redeployment, and each logistical adjustment contributed to a wider operational mosaic. In these hours, it became apparent that the day was not simply a sequence of routine maneuvers, but a carefully orchestrated escalation, unfolding within a controlled yet dynamic operational framework. However, behind this escalation lay an even more intricate sequence, the full implications of which were only beginning to surface. The unfolding events suggested that the day's developments were part of a complex and multi-layered plan, one that would soon challenge the conventional understanding of the operational balance. The game was advancing, but the true scale remained partially hidden, awaiting the next signals to emerge. By midday, the operational landscape had settled into a tense equilibrium. Units remained positioned across multiple sectors, their movements precise yet restrained, while logistical and reconnaissance networks maintained heightened activity. Official reports emphasized stability and readiness, repeating familiar assurances of routine management. Yet analysts observing the situation closely noted that today's deployments had created conditions for rapid escalation, should strategic objectives dictate. Across monitoring networks, the cumulative pattern of movements suggested a deliberate orchestration beyond what had been visible at first glance. Tactical flexibility, logistical depth, and integrated command coordination formed a matrix capable of executing decisive operations while maintaining operational security. In expert circles, the consensus emerged that today's apparent calm masked a complex sequence of actions, one whose ramifications could extend far beyond the immediate border region. Intelligence assessments highlighted the subtlety of the operational design. Supply lines were prepared for sustained throughput, reconnaissance systems maintained continuous coverage, and units were poised to shift rapidly along multiple axes. Analysts emphasized that such preparedness is typically reserved for carefully timed initiatives rather than routine rotations. Public messaging continued to stress normalcy, yet the day's activity revealed that a broader strategy had quietly entered execution, with contingencies embedded across multiple layers of command and support. At the same time, diplomatic and regional observation channels noted that the timing and scale of movement suggested sensitivity to external reaction. Analysts interpreted the deployment as calibrated, balancing the need for operational advantage with the risks of international escalation. The deliberate nature of the positioning, coupled with the apparent restraint in visible actions, reinforced the sense that today represented a carefully measured stage of a larger operational narrative. In these hours, the contrast between public reassurance and internal reality became increasingly pronounced. Observers concluded that what appeared as incremental adjustments were in fact part of a coherent operational strategy, designed to maintain initiative while controlling exposure. Units were deployed to maximize adaptability, creating options for both offensive and defensive action. Analysts highlighted that such sophistication was unusual for routine movements, underscoring the deliberate nature of today's planning and execution. Across the northern corridor, signals indicated that command structures remained fully engaged, synchronizing movements and maintaining situational awareness. Logistics hubs operated with unusual efficiency, ensuring that operational tempo could be maintained without interruption. The coordination of intelligence, supply, and maneuvering implied a level of foresight and planning that exceeded standard operational procedures, suggesting a strategic initiative unfolding in real time. Observers noted that the operational environment had entered a critical phase. While official narratives emphasized normalcy and controlled readiness, analysts interpreted the cumulative patterns as the early stages of a potentially decisive sequence. The day's events were shaping a dynamic operational framework, one that maintained the option for rapid escalation while keeping the broader public narrative composed and measured. At this juncture, the strategic implications of today's activity were only partially visible. Experts highlighted that while official channels projected stability, the underlying orchestration of forces, logistics, and intelligence created conditions for rapid action across multiple sectors. The day's movements revealed the depth of planning and the sophistication of operational design, yet the full scope remained concealed, accessible only to those observing the subtleties of execution. In expert assessments, the prevailing conclusion was clear: today marked a turning point, not through overt confrontation, but through the quiet, deliberate calibration of capability and position. The juxtaposition of external reassurance and internal dynamism created a landscape in which strategic intent could be enacted with precision while maintaining the appearance of routine. Analysts emphasized that the operational reality was layered, controlled, and continuously evolving. Possibly, it is worth following what will unfold in the coming hours, as each movement, adjustment, and logistical signal may reveal the deeper logic of today's orchestration. Observers who remain attentive are likely to discern the patterns that define the emerging operational trajectory. Today's developments, while outwardly composed, suggest that the larger strategy is still in motion, and the implications of these carefully calibrated deployments may only become apparent over time. Official communications maintained their emphasis on stability, yet the underlying signals continued to suggest that the day had produced a significant shift in operational posture. Analysts concluded that the movements represented not the end, but the initiation of a complex, multi-layered sequence whose full significance is yet to be revealed. The orchestration of forces, logistics, and intelligence ensured readiness for multiple contingencies, all while projecting calm to external audiences. On the surface, the day appeared measured, composed, and routine. Beneath that surface, however, the operational architecture had quietly shifted, establishing new capabilities, options, and readiness that could shape the border region in profound ways. The public narrative spoke of stability, but the full strategic depth remained accessible only to those attuned to the subtle indicators of planning and execution. At first glance, everything seemed under control. But for those observing closely, tracking movements, communications, and logistical patterns, it was evident that today marked the beginning of a phase whose outcomes had not yet revealed themselves. The orchestration was deliberate, complex, and ongoing, its full significance still unfolding behind the veil of official calm.